So, in front of me is Jonas Poher Rasmussen, and he's made an amazing movie called Flugt, which is a combination of documentary and animation, which moved me deeply, which is a very poetic film, and yet still very confrontational and thought-provoking, which I can highly recommend. I cannot recall having been this moved for a while, and but maybe we have viewers who have not seen the movie. So Jonas, I'm going to ask you, please describe this movie. What is this movie? What do we see? Tell me about it.
So Flugt is an animated documentary about a very dear friend of mine who I met when I was 15 and he was 16, and he arrived to my little Danish hometown all by himself from Afghanistan. And he stayed in foster care with a family just around the corner from where I lived, and learned Danish really fast. And soon we met up at the bus stop every morning going to high school, and we became very good friends. But he didn't want to. I was, of course, curious about his story, how and why he got to my village already back then, but he didn't want to talk about it. And of course respected that, but then our friendship...
In a certain period of time.
Yeah. And I of course respected that he didn't want to talk about it, but of course there was something, in our friendship, there was something hidden all the time that I was curious about. So that's kind of that's the genesis of the project.
And before we continue, a thing that was on my mind throughout watching this movie is, how is he doing now? How is he?
He's good. He's good. He's he's in the house. He ends up in the end of the film with his husband, and all the time I've known him, he's always been on the move, always heading somewhere else, and like everyone else, all of a sudden he had to stay at home for a year and a half. And I think he was a little concerned about how he would do, but he really enjoyed it. He really just enjoyed staying at home, and he sends me photos all the time from the garden of new flowers coming through. So he's good.
Tell me how you initiated this project. It must have come back to you. This has been on your mind since you knew him as a child, but what ignited making this movie? The
curiosity was always there. But it wasn't until I have a background in radio. I've done a lot of radio documentaries, and 15 years ago I asked him if I could do a radio documentary about his story. Mm-hmm. And he again said no, that he didn't want to talk about it. Or he didn't say he didn't want to talk about it, but he said he didn't feel ready to do it. But he knew that he would have to do it at some point. And he said when he was ready, he would like to do it with me. So I kind of had it in the back of my head that this was something we could do together at some point.
What was his reservations about? Naturally, having seen the movie, I can imagine, but can you describe that?
It was really about, carrying these traumas around for so long, being afraid of how I would look at him afterwards. He was afraid of being victimized. And also because he had this fake background story that he was given by the human traffickers. So he thought that it would have some kind of implications for his status in Denmark.
But there was always an element of risk,
yeah,
of giving up the truth,
yeah,
of how he came to Denmark.
Yeah.
What was your responsibility as a filmmaker there?
But one was like to make sure that that there was no legal issues for him. But another thing was...
How could you make sure?
But we had an attorney look at his file and make sure that, okay, but there's nothing can happen to his status in Denmark.
Because that many years have passed. And
no, but because his asylum was not given because of the story he was given. It was given because he was a minor.
Okay.
So there was no implications at all for him. He just didn't know.
He just didn't realize.
No, and it's because the human traffickers, they don't know the Danish law at all. So they just give these stories.
Wow.
Yeah. So but he didn't know. So that was one thing. And then the other thing was really, because this, what you see in the film, what you hear in the film, is his real voice telling the story for the very first time. So in the beginning, it was really about creating a space where he felt safe. One thing was the animation. The anonymity was kind of crucial for him to feel safe. Mm-hmm. But then it was also about, in the beginning to just say, okay, but we're just trying this out. There's no ties yet. We're just trying it out. So for the first year, or maybe a year and a half actually, the interviews I did, we kind of agreed on that we just tried it out. The interviews were done in my place, just the two of us. And we agreed that he could always say stop. He could always say, okay, but this isn't working for me, and he could walk out. So he always had like a back door. And also during an interview, he could say, I'm not ready to talk about this, and then we would stop. So he was really dictating the form in the beginning of the process.
And he also had a sort of final cut, approval situation.
No, actually, we agreed that he could kind of comment on things that were factually wrong. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, it was a conversation, ongoing conversation, because this story spans over more than 30 years. So there's so many different paths you can choose in it. So we had a conversation. I did kind of a document with all the transcriptions of the interviews I did, and I showed it to him what I wanted to be in the film. And then we'll have conversations if I had left something out that he felt was really key to understand his story, or if it didn't feel like this was representative of his story. So it was a conversation, but he was very generous. He was saying, "You're the one making the film, and I trust you."
And mind you, this is two friends making a movie together since childhood.
Yeah.
And how did that affect the whole process?
There was a lot at stake, I think, for both of us. For him, mostly because this is the first time he shares the story with anyone, really. And for me, because, he's my friend. So I really wanted to make sure that he felt seen, and that it felt genuine. So there was a lot at stake. But I like that. I like when you kind of, when it's not easy, like you need to really make an effort to make it work.
So this, aesthetically speaking, this whole layer of animation, which has an enormous impact on the viewer, what did that grow out of? I guess it was a kind of protection of both of you, or?
Yeah, first of all, a protection for him, but also because, it's a story where most of it takes place in the past. So it's really about finding a way to make the past come back alive. How do you make his childhood home in Afghanistan come back alive? How do you make Afghanistan in the 80s come back alive and Moscow in the 90s? And how do you place him in there without it being, actors trying to reenact things in something that's not Afghanistan because you can't shoot there? And, so it's really about finding a way where it felt honest to the testimony I was given, because you have this voice underneath it all. So finding a format that really paid tribute to that and supported the testimony. And here animation was really key, also because it's really a story about memory and trauma. And with the animation, it really allowed us to be a lot more expressive than we could have been with a camera, and go into these sequences where he's talking about his traumas and his innermost secrets in a way where it felt more honest somewhat to what his emotions were than trying to depict what things looked like in that specific situation.
Well, I guess no matter how you turn this around, this is a very dark tale. Of course, makes it at the end, he's an exception, unfortunately, but it's a very, very dark tale. And the animation, I guess, creates an element of enlightenment. Is there a limit to how much you as a narrator or a creator, and a limit to how much an audience can take? Is there a point where things collapse and you just can't deal with it anymore? And did the animation influence that?
Yeah, but definitely, I think so. And I think especially with these kind of stories, because you're exposed to so many refugee stories all the time. And just speaking for myself, I block out a lot of it because you can't take everything in because it gets overwhelming. But I think because it's animation, because you don't have a real human face there you have to relate to, I think it's a little easier. And you start to listen more to what's actually being said and you experience his story. And then there's also, a lot of lightness also comes from the fact that this is told from the inside of a friendship. And when we're friends, we laugh together, and you as the audience, you're invited to laugh with us. And as soon as you laugh with a protagonist of the film, that creates a connection. And when you create a connection, then that generates empathy. So I think it's really to create nuance to the refugee story. I had a feeling that because this is told from the inside of friendship, there's a more clear way into people's hearts.
Well, I find it genius that the way that this animation layer is so playful, and that gives me, as a spectator, the opportunity to breathe.
Yeah.
And be playful with you and absorb more, which actually at the end of the film gives an even more profound and powerful emotional reaction than normally. So it's ironic that this layer of protection and playfulness and whatever you can call it actually ends up giving an even more powerful impression. So aesthetically speaking, since we're talking about this animation layer, what inspired you?
This is my first animation film, so it was really a quite steep learning curve for me.
Mm-hmm.
So luckily I had this animation studio, Sun Creature Studios, who did all the animation. And they kind of took me into the world of animation. And in the beginning it was just me and the art directors kind of looking at references, finding out, okay, I like this, I like this, I like this. And also visual artists, the color and light is inspired by Edward Hopper. We're also inspired by photographers like Ray K. Metzger and Alexander Gronsky. So we had a huge pile of references. And then we did some tests, and the first test we did became a little toony, so the characters had big eyes and the line was very smooth. And it worked, but it also became a little bit detached from the testimony, from the voice underneath. So we kind of had to go back and work on a style that felt more real, felt more authentic. And authenticity was really like a key word in the process of finding a style for the film.
So how does this film, how did it affect Amin?
It was a process. I think he was quite happy that it took that long to make the film, because it took like 8 years. Because for him, being able to just open up slowly, and in the beginning just to me, and in the process of talking to me, he also started to talking to other people, and all of a sudden he felt, okay, but I'm actually able to talk about these things. So in the end, it was really helpful for him to kind of get rid is maybe the wrong word, but get the story out there. So he felt like he could connect his past and his present, because for so many years he'd been living with having to hide parts of himself. As a kid in Afghanistan, he couldn't be openly gay. Then coming to Denmark, all of a sudden he couldn't live with his past. So all of his life he's had to flee parts of himself. So to finally be able to connect everything and find a place in the world where he can be who he is with everything really helped him.
Is there a certain point in the movie that when you walk the red carpet and you sit down and there's an audience and Amin probably is next to you, is there a certain scene that you look most forward to?
Well, there's the scene at the gay bar. Definitely, that one is kind of, you can really sense that people have their heart up here. Mm-hmm. And then it just kind of sinks down, and there's a sad relief, which is really wonderful.
So it's a moment of hope.
It's a moment of hope, yeah.
So you enjoy that moment of hope given to the audience.
Yeah.
Right.
But also, I think the sequence when he's on the sinking fishing boat, and there's this big Norwegian cruise ship coming by, because from the very beginning when he told me that story, I kind of I felt like, okay, but now I'm in the cruise ship. Exactly. I'm looking at him telling his story, and I can't do anything. It all just happened. And to kind of create that kind of perspective for people to see that some people are really struggling.
I felt attacked by that scene in a great way. That was the kind of scene that made me reflect, because obviously it was me and you on that ship. Yeah. And it made me think about our responsibility as spectators, but particularly for you as a maker of this movie. Is it enough to throw light on things, or do you have to stick your hands into it?
If you kind of tell these stories and get the stories out there, so people will see what's going on, is getting your hands in there, like a journalist or. So I think that's my way of doing something, definitely.
So this was Jonas Poher Rasmussen with his film Flee, which I recommend you watch as fast as you can. It's an amazing piece of work.